Jordan Steele walked into the first-class lounge with an air of quiet confidence, his tailored suit fitting perfectly as he scanned the space. He had every right to be there. He'd earned his way, though no one would know that just by looking at him. His hands brushed against the marble countertops as he walked past the gleaming floors and plush velvet chairs. As he settled into a corner, a staff member stepped forward, a crisp white shirt and name tag reading, gleaming in the fluorescent light. "Excuse me, sir," she began with a strained politeness. "Are you sure you're in the right area?" Her voice, though smooth, carried a note of skepticism. Jordan paused, glancing at her with raised eyebrows. He knew exactly what she was implying, and it wasn't subtle. He was accustomed to these looks, the assumptions that followed him because of his skin tone and the way people perceived his wealth. There was no mistaking it. The staff here were looking at him as though he'd wandered in by mistake, someone out of place. "I believe so," Jordan said calmly, his voice steady as he shifted his gaze to a nearby seat. "I have a boarding pass for this area. It's not a mistake." Catherine hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on him, calculating. Behind her, Margaret, the senior manager, overheard the exchange and strode over with a slight smirk on her face. Margaret had been watching Jordan ever since he entered. She was no stranger to spotting outsiders, people who didn't belong in places like this, and something about Jordan's presence didn't sit right with her. "Well, isn't this interesting?" Margaret interjected loudly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "I imagine he must have used some kind of reward points, or maybe an upgrade from a buddy, huh? I don't think I've seen you around here before." Jordan stiffened but remained calm, keeping his voice smooth. "I paid for my ticket. No rewards, no favors." Margaret's sharp laugh echoed slightly in the large room. "Oh, I'm sure you did," she said with a patronizing glance. "But you know, people like you don't always fit in where they don't belong." The words hung in the air, heavy with condescension. The uncomfortable silence stretched for a moment before Jordan met her gaze directly, his voice low but firm. "Perhaps you should check the system again," he suggested, his eyes not leaving hers. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Margaret, caught off guard by his composure, gave a stiff nod and turned away, but the damage was done. The eyes of the lounge had all shifted, whispers flowing through the air. Jordan took a seat, resolute. No matter how they saw him, he was going to remain right here. Ethan Cruz was organizing his travel documents at the front of the first-class cabin when he felt a sharp tap on his shoulder. He turned around, already anticipating trouble. Sophia, a flight attendant with icy blue eyes, was standing there, her expression cold. "You need to provide proof of authorization to be in this section," Sophia demanded, her tone bordering on accusatory. "If you're not supposed to be here, I'll have to ask you to leave." Ethan, taken aback, quickly gathered his papers, but before he could respond, Sophia raised her hand, cutting him off. "I don't care about the paperwork, Mr. Cruz," she continued. "We've had people sneak in here before, and I don't want any trouble." She scrutinized his face with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't about the paperwork. It was about him. "It's not exactly usual for someone like you to be in first class." Ethan frowned, feeling the sting of her words. He had been accustomed to these quiet challenges all his life. The glances, the subtle jabs about his background, his last name, his skin color, the assumption that he didn't belong. "I'm not sure what you mean by someone like me," Ethan replied, his voice even but with a touch of edge. Here with the valid ticket. No need for any drama." Sophia's eyes narrowed. She didn't buy it. "I've seen your kind before," she muttered under her breath. "You think you're above the rules just because you've got some money or status, but I'm not fooled. Show me your documents." "Now." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't back down. "My ticket's valid. I don't have to prove anything to you," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. Sophia crossed her arms, still standing in his space. "We'll see about that," she said, her eyes cold with suspicion. "If you're not willing to cooperate, I'll have to call security. I won't tolerate people abusing the system." Ethan, visibly frustrated, opened his phone and pulled up the ticket, the boarding pass flashing on the screen in front of her. "Here," he said flatly. "Now, do your job and let me board." Sophia took a long look at the screen, but the weight of her judgment was already clear. She was forcing him to prove himself, to confirm that he was worthy of the seat he had rightfully earned. After a moment, she grudgingly stepped aside, though her gaze remained hostile. "You'll be watched," she said coldly as she walked away, leaving Ethan to stew in the humiliation of the moment. The tension in the air was thick, as the whispers among the other passengers began again, as if the mere presence of Ethan, and Jordan too, was a disruption to their comfortable world. As Jordan, a well-known social media influencer, steps onto the plane, his fans Kayla and Anna, both young women of color, burst into excited applause, practically jumping out of their seats to greet him. Their enthusiasm fills the cabin, their voices loud but full of admiration. Kayla clutches her phone, attempting to snap a picture of Jordan, while Anna laughs, trying to get his attention with a playful wave. Their energy is infectious, causing a ripple of smiles among nearby passengers. However, not everyone shares the same excitement. Margaret, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, sitting a few rows ahead, stiffens. She exchanges a glance with her husband, Henry, before turning to the flight attendant, her voice dripping with disdain. "Excuse me," Margaret says, with an exaggerated, controlled tone. "Can you please ask them to tone it down? It's really quite inappropriate for such behavior in a first-class cabin." The flight attendant, trying to keep the peace, nods awkwardly, but Margaret's words don't end there. "I don't care who they think they are. There's no reason for all that noise. We're in a professional environment, not a fan convention." Kayla and Anna, still grinning with excitement, are oblivious to the judgment being cast upon them. They don't notice Margaret's glare as they finally sit down, continuing to chat animatedly about Jordan's latest posts. "Just because someone has followers doesn't mean we should all be subjected to this ruckus," Margaret mutters under her breath, hoping to be heard, though the flight attendant keeps his distance. Her eyes narrow as she shakes her head, clearly displeased by what she perceives as a lack of decorum. "Can even enjoy a flight without people treating it like a circus," Margaret adds, though her words are far louder than she intends. The atmosphere in the cabin becomes noticeably tense. As the plane takes off, the sound of excited chatter from Kayla and Anna continues to fill the air. But Margaret's frustration only grows, and she begins to voice her complaints more openly. "I just don't understand why they have to be so loud," Margaret says, her words slipping out under her breath but still audible to those sitting nearby. "I mean, it's just so uncivilized. This is first class, not the back of the plane." Her complaints are sharp and pointed, though disguised behind what she tries to present as mere concern. The airline really needs to do something about this. The noise level is absolutely uncalled for, she continues, her voice laced with judgment. They should make sure that first class stays professional. No more of this behavior. Her husband Henry looks uncomfortable but says nothing, keeping his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. Margaret's tone grows more insistent as she speaks to a passing flight attendant. Honestly, I'm all for diversity, Margaret adds with a tight smile, attempting to mask the edge in her voice. But it's not too much to ask for some order. It's not right that we have to endure this in a premium section of the plane. The flight attendant, caught between diffusing the tension and maintaining professionalism, gives Margaret a polite smile but says nothing. Meanwhile, Kayla and Anna, unaware of the comments being made, continue to share stories about Jordan, their laughter echoing through the cabin. To them, it's just a moment of joy, a fan meeting their idol. But to Margaret it feels like a constant assault on the peace she believes she is entitled to. The whole situation is just too much, Margaret mutters to Henry. I mean, what is this world coming to? When people don't know how to act in public, they should be placed somewhere else, anywhere but here. As Margaret turns to stare out the window, her thoughts about how the world has changed, how she feels displaced by the new energy, linger. It's clear that this experience, though brief, is one of many instances where she feels her personal expectations of decorum are being challenged, even by something as simple as a flight in first class. The feeling of unease, of not belonging in the environment she once thought was for her alone, lingers like an unspoken tension hanging in the air. As the plane cruised comfortably at 300 feet, Maria adjusted herself in her seat, her baby nestled in her arms. The gentle sound of the cabin hum was interrupted by a sudden, sharp voice. "Excuse me," Margaret's voice cut through the low murmur of the cabin. "Could you please cover up, or perhaps move to the back of the plane?" Maria, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and confusion, glanced around to see the eyes of nearby passengers on her. "I'm breastfeeding my baby," Maria said calmly. "It's natural." Margaret scoffed, her face tightening in disapproval. "I don't care what you're doing. It's inappropriate. Nobody wants to see that." Carlos, seated beside Margaret, nodded in agreement. "She's right, Maria. You should be more considerate. There are children on this plane." He shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward other passengers. Jasmine, seated across the aisle, couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her voice rose, cutting through the tension. "Actually, it's her right. Breastfeeding isn't something to be ashamed of. You don't get to police a mother feeding her child." Margaret's face flushed. "Well, I just think it's wrong. I've never had to deal with this kind of thing." Maria's hand tightened around her baby, who had begun to fuss. She lifted him a little higher, trying to ignore the uncomfortable stares. Jasmine leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe it's time we all learned to be a little more accepting, Margaret. This isn't about you. It's about her baby's needs." Margaret shifted uncomfortably, but her eyes remained fixed on Maria. The tension was palpable, as if the air itself had grown thicker. "I'm just saying, it's not appropriate." "You're entitled to your opinion," Jasmine retorted, "but you're not entitled to make other people uncomfortable for doing what's best for their children." Maria, feeling a rush of gratitude toward Jasmine, offered a small smile before turning her focus back to her baby. The room fell silent again, though the weight of the disagreement lingered. The smooth hum of the plane was interrupted by an unmistakable voice from the aisle. "Excuse me, sir," the flight attendant called, stepping toward Liam Carter, a young black man in his late 20s seated in first class. "I'm afraid I need to ask you to step aside. Security has a few questions." Liam's face tightened, confused. What's going on? Is there a problem? A few people who believed in ghosts made their way in on skeleton corpses. Margaret, who had been watching with hawk-like scrutiny, leaned over to Carlos and whispered loudly, "He must have been placed here by mistake. People like him don't belong in first class." Jasmine, overhearing Margaret's comment, flinched with disgust. "People like him," she muttered under her breath, standing up to confront Margaret. "What exactly are you implying?" Before Margaret could respond, the flight attendant returned, now flanked by 2 uniformed security officers. "Sir, we just need to confirm your boarding pass," one of the officers explained, though his tone was oddly strained. Margaret raised her voice. "See, I told you. How does a man like him afford to sit up here? It's a mistake." Liam stood, a mix of confusion and irritation in his eyes. "I'm here because I earned my seat. Now, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate it if you stopped assuming things about me." Carlos, his discomfort palpable, tried to downplay the situation. Let's just get this sorted out quickly, okay?" Liam's patience was wearing thin. "You know, it's always the same. People like Margaret here think they can make assumptions about others based on their appearance. It's getting old." The flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances, but eventually the situation was cleared up. The officers, slightly embarrassed, returned to their duties, leaving Liam to settle back into his seat. Jasmine leaned over to him, her voice a quiet but firm reassurance. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Liam. Don't let them make you feel small." Later, as the flight entered its final stretch, a sudden disturbance arose. "My purse!" Margaret's voice screeched, cutting through the low murmurs of the cabin. "Someone has taken my purse!" People buying up fast food for their lunches and then later trying to sound more intelligent than normal. "I bet one of them took it. You can't trust people like that, can you?" Liam, overhearing, stood up. "Excuse me?" he said sharply, his voice rising. "Are you really accusing people because of the color of their skin?" Margaret's eyes darted around, now fixed on Liam. "It's obvious. Who else could it be?" She pointed toward a middle-aged woman in the back. "And her, too. Always the same." Jasmine stood up from her seat, her voice cool but firm. "You need to stop right now. There's no reason to make these accusations. Just because they're not white doesn't mean they're criminals." Maria, from the front of the cabin, turned to the crew. "It's disgusting that you're letting her get away with this. No one has stolen anything." The tension was thick, and passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The flight attendants quickly intervened, and after a brief search, it was discovered that Margaret had simply misplaced her purse. Her face reddened in embarrassment, but she didn't apologize. As the plane began its descent, Liam, his voice steady but strong, turned to Margaret. "Next time, don't let your ignorance get the best of you. People are not their skin color." Jasmine stood beside him, her eyes unwavering. "We all deserve respect, no matter where we come from or how we look." The flight landed in silence, but the message of unity and justice hung in the air, echoing louder than any accusations could. The plane was humming steadily as it cruised at 300 feet. The once harmonious atmosphere in first class had now shifted, thanks to Margaret's constant complaints. Her disapproving glares and sharp remarks had made everyone in the vicinity uncomfortable. She wasn't done yet. "I can't take it anymore. I'm not safe here," Margaret exclaimed suddenly, clutching her armrest as if in terror. Her voice trembled, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. There are too many people I don't recognize. Too many people who don't belong in first class. A few passengers exchanged glances, but none dared to speak up. Margaret's face was flushed with indignation as she turned to the flight attendant Sophia, who had been serving drinks nearby. "Call the captain. I demand an unscheduled landing. I feel unsafe with this unfamiliar crowd." Sophia, her eyes wide with confusion, hesitated but complied, rushing to notify the cockpit. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her tirade, casting disdainful looks at the passengers of color in first class, her words dripping with prejudice. "Something needs to be done about this. It's completely unacceptable," Margaret muttered, eyes narrowing. "I refuse to be surrounded by people who don't understand our way of life." Her outburst caused a ripple of tension to spread through the cabin. The pilot, after consulting with ground control, reluctantly ordered an unscheduled landing, causing a chain reaction of delays and cancellations that affected the entire flight. Margaret's lies had caused chaos, delays that would inconvenience hundreds, and all for the sake of her discomfort. Back in the terminal, Robert Spencer, the CEO of the airline, had just landed from a business trip when he was briefed on the situation. Furious, he marched to the gate, where the passengers had been herded like cattle, awaiting further instructions. He spotted Margaret immediately, standing arrogantly near the entrance, acting as though she had single-handedly saved the day. "Margaret!" Robert's voice was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the terminal. "I've just been briefed about your actions. You've caused unnecessary delays and chaos based on a fabricated story." Margaret looked up, feigning innocence. "I was only trying to protect myself, Robert. Don't you understand how dangerous it is with so many unfamiliar faces, especially—" "Enough," Robert snapped, cutting her off. His gaze turned toward Carlos, the senior flight attendant, who stood silently by Margaret's side. "Carlos, I'll be addressing your role in this. I'm sure your report will be very telling." Carlos flinched, realizing his complicity in Margaret's behavior. Beside him, Sophia, who had been trying to defuse the situation earlier, lowered her head, ashamed of the way she had been manipulated into assisting Margaret. "I'm ordering a full investigation into your behavior, Margaret," Robert continued, his tone unwavering. "This company does not condone discrimination in any form, and neither will I. You and your neighbors will face the consequences of your actions." Margaret's face paled as she realized her position had just shifted dramatically. I didn't mean to cause all this trouble," she stammered, but Robert was already walking away, his back turned to her in dismissal. As news of the CEO's intervention spread, the passengers, who had once been divided by fear and uncertainty, began to unite. Tasha, a black woman who had been seated near Margaret, stood up, her voice strong and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've all felt the tension in the air, the discomfort of being judged for who we are, but we can't let that divide us. We can't allow someone's fear and prejudice to ruin the experience for all of us." Jordan, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, nodded in agreement. He rose to his feet and addressed the crowd, his words powerful and impassioned. "We are all human beings, deserving of respect, no matter our skin color, background, or where we come from. Margaret's actions today were a reflection of ignorance and intolerance, but we, as a collective, are stronger than that." The room fell silent, and for the first time, the passengers of various races, genders, and backgrounds seemed to breathe as one. Jordan's words had bridged the gap, uniting the diverse group. The people who had once been passive witnesses to Margaret's lies were now standing together, refusing to let fear and prejudice define them. "We will not be divided," Jordan continued. "We'll stand together against those who seek to tear us apart. And when the truth is revealed, when the lies are exposed, we will be the ones left standing, proud of who we are, proud of our unity." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Tasha, standing next to him, offered a small, grateful smile. This moment, this powerful, collective stand, was their victory. They had turned the chaos Margaret created into a moment of strength and solidarity, and nothing could take that away.